Okay, so I'm not even completely sure how to spoiler warning this video, let alone actually start discussing the main topic. I guess we're going back to doing these in 2 layers now. First off, yeah, I'm gonna have to spoil the entire Xenoblade trilogy that was capped off with Future Redeemed. That's a given, but there will be more stuff, and I'm drawing this out for a few more seconds so you can leave if you don't want to be spoiled on the nature of the other spoiler warning, because it is a big one. Okay? Okay. I will also need to bring in complete spoilers for the Xenosaga trilogy, and also background lore details but not plot spoilers for Xenogears and Xenoblade X. Yeah, we're bringing in stuff from the entire Xeno series now. They were not playing around with this one. Okay, actual video time. I'm pretty sure everyone watching this video is deep enough into Xeno where they were well aware that Future Redeemed was in no means going to be the end of the series, but I don't think anyone was expecting it to only be the end of the beginning. If you asked me a week ago how many different universes there were across the entire Xeno series, I would have told you 5. Future Redeemed made the information that led to that conclusion outdated. As it turns out, there are only 3. It's been 17 long years, of which I've only been around for about 8. But despite that, I'm still incredibly happy I'm able to be here, now that we can finally say, welcome home, Cosmos. Yeah, so, I'm gonna do a general discussion video on my thoughts on Future Redeemed and all of that stuff. I think it's great, easily on par with Torna. Most of the gameplay changes are good or neutral at worst. Matthew and A are both fantastic, and I absolutely love what was done with Shulk and Rex, as well as, the bits of explanations for In Ionio stuff we got, but none of that matters right now. Xenosaga is canon, apparently. And since we know they said that they had the base idea for 3 when they were still conceptualizing 2, this was probably in the back of the minds of some people at Monolith since, Project Cross Zone 2, a game which released in 2015, 7 months after X, by the way, which featured Fiora and Cosmos as a tag team pair, but also Maineth/Galea and Mary were there, and those two interacted with each other and, seemingly recognized each other, so I'm not sure exactly how long the long game on this one was, but I have to respect it either way, and more than that, I am amazed Nintendo let them get away with this. The amount they're buddy-buddying with Bandai Namco has reached unprecedented heights at this point. And yes, to cut you off if you're starting to think that way, this is just Nintendo being buddy-buddy with Bandai Namco. This does not mean that they have actually purchased the publishing rights for the Xenosaga series from them. If that were the case, we would still have all the big Xenosaga references here tying the canons together, but Bandai Namco wouldn't be listed as special thanks in the credits. It was reported in September 2022, after the base game of Xenoblade 3 released, and clearly after the plotline for Future Redeemed had been finalized, that Bandai Namco re-registered the Xenosaga trademark. I don't think they'd be the one doing that if they sold the IP off to Nintendo. That being said, the radio scene has unironically created the people who don't know people who know meme in the Xeno community, and you may understandably worry that things are going to get kind of weird and elitist, because the only way to play the Saga trilogy right now is either shelling out an obscene amount of money for old PS2 games, or having a device powerful enough to emulate them, which is a bit dodgy when it comes to that console in general, and Saga 1 specifically, which also costs a lot of money. However, I am fully convinced that we are getting some sort of Xenosaga port or remaster now, in between now and whatever the next Blade game is. We were told that after playing 3 and Future Redeemed, we would know where the series was going in the future. And it turned out, that was tying Xenosaga into it. If they want to continue on this path they've explicitly said they're going to do, they're gonna have to make the Saga trilogy accessible to current players so they can understand literally anything that's going on, even if the next game's callbacks and references to both the Blade and Saga trilogies are as small and unnecessary to enjoy the story as, say, the Xenoblade 1 references in Xenoblade 2. Oh, and the Katsuhiro Harada statement saying that they did market research for Xenosaga remasters and they were deemed non-profitable is completely irrelevant now. That was a 2019 statement about a 2014 market analysis. And you know what hadn't happened in 2014? Xenoblade 2 and 3. Things that made the Xeno series several times more popular than it's ever been at any previous point in its existence. Bandai Namco isn't Square. they're capable of good business decisions, so I'm pretty sure it's within their faculties to have done another market research at some point in the last 9 years and come to the conclusion that, oh wait, people would definitely pay money for 3 more Xeno games that most people haven't gotten a chance to play yet. And think about it this way. In summer 2023, we're going to be getting Baten Kaitos series remasters. That's an early 2000s Monolith-developed RPG series still owned by Bandai Namco, even if the second game was in fact published by Nintendo. Bamco re-registered the trademark for that in 2021. Xenosaga is an early 2000s Monolith-developed RPG series still owned by Bandai Namco that had its trademark renewed in 2022 and is now directly tied into the canon of Nintendo's second biggest RPG series that they own completely, because I'm pretty sure Fire Emblem's still a bit bigger, and we're not even talking about Pokemon. The Baten Kaitos remasters don't have an exact release date at time of recording, but I'm gonna say within 18 months of those releasing, we're going to get a Xenosaga Trilogy remaster or port or something for whatever the current Switch model is at that time. So yeah, apparently Xenosaga 4 is real, and is also the same thing as Xenoblade 4. We've been talking for months about how the series is finally ending the Klaus saga. Little did we know, they stapled the entire Shion saga onto the front half of that, just so like 85 to 90% of Xenoblade fans would have something to play and mull over while they work on the first game of whatever the new thing is, which I am going to call the Radio Saga until we get more information about it, and you cannot stop me. Alright, you got your 1-minute intro, you got your 5 minutes of mostly hinged discussion of how, regardless of whether or not you're capable of playing Xenosaga right now, you will have the option to do so on a Nintendo system before it becomes relevant to a future Xenoblade game. I think I've earned whatever monstrosity the rest of this video is going to turn into. Let me have this completely unhinged rambling on the entire radio scene. Sorry, I actually meant the 2 radio scenes, because you may have forgotten there was a second, smaller one beforehand. It doesn't have all of the many Xeno references like the second one does, but it still sets the stage and provides a little bit of interesting lore. First things first, to the best of my knowledge, the names Sienna Morgan and Barry Crowley are not references to anything. They're definitely not a reference to anything in another Xeno game, and it seems like they just chose reasonable names that a person in the 21st century would have that sound good alongside names from Xenosaga and Xenoblade X, because this scene references those games a lot, and also just sound like the kind of name a radio personality would have. Secondly, we can now explicitly say that the Siren model kit lore is canon to the series. The name Radamanthus is directly dropped in Xenoblade 2 itself, but Sienna later mentions that Dimitri Yuriev is from the Minos Authority, and that and Iacus are the name of the 2 other big space elevators in addition to Radamanthus that were mentioned on the kit. It also describes the discovery of the Conduit in a near identical way to the discovery of the Zohar in the Xenosaga series, and since, well, they're the same series now, that much is also definitely canon. Most damningly though, the radio broadcast mentions the Coalition Government, which is the exact same name of the Unified Earth Government in Xenoblade X. This is important because that name was changed in localization from something similar but distinctly different in Japanese, and that Japanese name is used in both the Japanese version of the radio broadcast and the Japan-only Siren Kit, which means the localization team went out of their way to not directly translate something in order to retain consistency with something that was changed in localization for a previous game that Nintendo of Europe didn't even touch. Which means the X references were extremely intentional, and since they line up in Japanese, that more or less just means that all of the Siren stuff is canon. Alright, that was neat and important, but what did that have to do with the first little radio broadcast? Because a lot of the stuff I talked about was in the second one. Well, that deals with the term Radamanthus Authority, which I think you can intuitively agree is the region around the Radamanthus space elevator, which can obviously be seen in the background, and Rex directly acknowledges as a peeled version of All Rest World Tree. I've seen people say that the landscape looks a lot like California, and people are maybe thinking, oh, even if X isn't directly canon, which it isn't, trust me, I'll get there, this is located in Los Angeles, as a reference to the fact that the big city in X was New Los Angeles. That is unfortunately not the case, as knowing the Siren Kit is canon now means we also know that all 3 of the space elevators were located on the equator. That being said, it is impossible to pick 3 points on the equator that are all equidistant from each other and all on existing land, So I'm pretty sure at least 2 of the space elevators were located on some sort of artificial land in the middle of the ocean, and I'm pretty sure that's the case here. That to me suggests that the suburban US aesthetic is because the US was responsible for building this specific space elevator, or at least the habitable region around it for people either working on the space station or associated with it or that kind of thing. And knowing how Xeno likes to do this kind of thing, Rhadamanthus was probably located in the East Pacific, relatively close to the US, and it was administered by them. Then the second tree was in the West Pacific and was administered by Japan, and the third one was outright on land, being in Kenya. I'm picking Kenya because despite having to fudge the whole 3 towers being equidistant thing to make that work, that country is specifically where the Conduit and the Xenosaga Zohar were said to have been discovered, with Xenosaga even outright stating the lake it was found at. And that lake is under 200 miles or 300 kilometers north of the equator, so I'm guessing that's how they got the Conduit into space in the first place, and just used the orbital ring to send it over to the other tower at some point later down the line, though admittedly some Xenosaga lore does kind of contradict that. This tracks surprisingly well with the US road signs being found in both Elysium and the Land of Moritha in Xenoblade 2, especially because they list central city and interstate numbers that don't exist. So, a brand new floating island administered by the US that includes a city and suburbs actually makes all that make a whole lot of sense. And in fact, the idea that the entire Land of Moritha was a city on an artificially created island in the middle of the ocean also makes Rex's statement that all the life in Alrest could have fit in the empty Elysium habitat when he finds it, and also statements that both Bionis and Mechanis and Alrest had way less people than Earth did in its prime, make a whole lot more sense. Yeah, there was an entire Earth there, but the entire world of Alrest only made up a small part of it because Titans are much smaller than countries and even a lot of just islands that are parts of countries in the real world. And I don't remember anyone in Xenoblade 2 ever talking about having been out of sight of the world tree. Anyway, the only things that contradict this are the fact that the temperature is given in centigrade and not in Fahrenheit, though that could probably be chalked up to the coalition government being comprised also of the 90% of the people on Earth don't use that temperature scale, and the fact that, despite this being a game with characters that have American accents, both Sienna and Barry have British ones, but even then, there's no way these made cities around the beanstalks wouldn't have people from all over the world, and it could just very easily be that these two just happened to be British. And again, Dimitri Yuriev is name-dropped. He is a Xenosaga character. Everyone in that series has an American accent, and for what it's worth, his English VA, who is American, is still active, so if they do end up making a Xenoblade 0, which I don't think they're gonna do since they said this is about the future, he will still have his original voice. Alright, that's the whole Rhadamanthus Authority discussion out of the way, other than the fact that, wow, the city sure does look like 5th Jerusalem from Xenosaga. It's almost like the same society built both of them. And now we can talk about the other important part of the first radio message, the date Wednesday, May 16th. We know from the Siren Kit and Birth of a Universe cutscene that both the discovery of the Conduit and Klaus's experiment were in the 21st century, which means that this memory of Alpha's can only take place in one of the years of that century that has a Wednesday, May 16th. Those years are 2001, 2007, 2012, 2018, 2029, 2035, 2040, 2046, 2057, 2063, 2068, 2074, 2085, 2091, and 2096. While Xenosaga just gives the century for the discovery of the Zohar, the Siren Kit does explicitly say it was early in the 21st century, but despite that, I'm pretty sure we can fairly reasonably rule out any year that has already happened, as regardless of when the Conduit/Zohar was discovered, it would still take at least a decade or so for all of these advances in technology and all of that stuff to actually be put into effect, and for something as big as a massive floating city and space elevator to be made. It's also worth pointing out that this Wednesday, May 16th is absolutely not the same day Klaus's experiment took place, as when that happened, the people in charge of the first low orbit station were actively fighting off an attack from the Saviorite rebels. We are given the name Saviorite again in this sequence, But that's being applied to a human rights bill that's currently being debated and has a lot of pushback against it. So I'm pretty sure the whole rebellion thing didn't start until the bill was, like, officially shot down, which means there's gotta be at least a few months of escalation in between Dimitri Yuriev making a formal statement as a member of government and a group of rebels in artifices trying to attack a space station and get at the conduit. You may also notice that this pretty handily debunks one of the biggest pieces of X-copium I've seen going around, that one of the new Philadelphia-class motherships was in fact the White Whale. It's outright stated that the White Whale was launched and Earth was destroyed in the year 2054, and the closest year to that without going over, with the Wednesday, May 16th, is 2046. This means that 8 years and change would have to pass between this bill being a very hotly debated thing among the public, and it getting shot down and the war progressing to the point where people and artificers were trying to take the conduit. That seems somewhat reasonable, but with the heightened level of technology and the fact that Dimitri Yuriev of all people was involved, suggests to me that the timeline is a bit more condensed than that. That doesn't matter though, because what people are saying is that because the next ship is going to launch in July, that ship is the White Whale, which launched in July. Except for the fact that it's July of the same year as the radio broadcast, which by calendar cannot be 2054. And also it's said that the Philadelphia class ship can only carry 1.5 million people, when we are directly told that 20 million people were aboard the White Whale. And the best part is, all of that doesn't matter, because in the Xenoblade trilogy and Xenosaga, Earth was destroyed due to experiments with the Zohar or conduit going wrong. In Xenoblade X, Earth was destroyed as collateral between two warring alien, not human rebel, factions fighting above the planet. One of those factions, the Ghosts, had vehicles powered by antimatter, and it was a bunch of those antimatter cores contacting the surface of the planet that caused it to explode. And yes, I said explode. That kind of directly contradicts with the whole fact that there is a physical Earth present again at the end of Future Redeemed. Earth in X was effectively destroyed by a massive annihilation event, where, in the trilogy, Earth was technically not even destroyed. It was ripped apart in two by Klaus's experiment, and according to Xenosaga, it was never explicitly said it was destroyed either, as it was just rendered inaccessible, with the leading theory that it was shrunk down to Planck scale, or basically rendered infinitesimally small. What Future Redeemed is saying is that it wasn't made small, the experiment ripped it apart into two, and those two pieces were in pocket dimensions. Yeah, we're actually bringing back my old Xenoblade 1 was a pocket dimension theory. That was totally disproven by 3, but it turns out that 1 and 2 were both pocket dimensions, encompassing different aspects of Earth, which was known in that universe by people who had left it as Lost Jerusalem. It is extremely important to the lore of Xenosaga that aliens do not exist, when it was aliens that were responsible for Earth's destruction in X. It's also been outright shown that it was human rebels responsible for the war over the conduit in the trilogy that ultimately led to Earth's destruction. Xenoblade X and Xenosaga cannot take place in the same universe no matter what you do, and the lore of the Klaus trilogy has lined up with Saga way more ever since 2, and this is just adding more on top of that. There are a few things that may be contradictions that I will get into later with the Saga stuff, but even then, that is mostly light retcons. In order to fit X in, you would not only need to completely disregard all of the Saga stuff that works perfectly, but also fundamentally alter the universe we've seen so far in the trilogy. This radio broadcast does in fact reference every single Xeno game besides the trilogy it's capping off, but the difference between those is that the Gears references are very light because they legally can't do more. The X references are in fact just references and reusing similar terminology for similar things in a different universe, and as someone who's been lucky enough to play the entire Xeno series, the Saga references are definitely the most intense, the most in line with what we already knew about the lore of this world, and the ones they're definitely focusing on the most, despite the fact that Nintendo actually owns X. And yeah, let's get to actually discussing those references directly, because, well, that entire rant stemmed from the May 16th date, not from any of the stuff directly mentioned in the second part of the broadcast. You know, the bigger part. The one that acknowledges the existence of other Xeno games. So, let's get on that. I love the fact that this second part of the broadcast is directly framed as Sienna catching up new listeners on stuff she'd already talked about, because that's literally what the scene is on a meta level. It's basically Monolith going, people who have played Saga already, we know you know. And people who haven't, good news. You got a whole lot more good Xeno to go through before you're fully caught up for our next game, so you have something to tide yourselves over with. Except, I'm gonna say probably without the bad Riku voice. Anyway, the first actually important sentence is, at midnight on the 16th, the first Radamanthus spaceport saw the launch of Earth-Life Colonization Project's 8th mothership, the Icarus, taking 480,000 settlers to the Eta Carinae Nebula in the Carina Sagittarius arm of the Milky Way. The first thing is the revelation that Klaus's society was actually developing interstellar-capable spaceships and had already been sending people out to colonize the stars before he did an oopsie on the planet. I hesitate to even call this a retcon because it's just adding more information that doesn't really contradict with anything and makes perfect sense. A society that's capable of building multiple space elevators in a massive orbital ring also definitely has the capacity to make massive interstellar arc ships. Saga lore indicates that the UMN was at least partially developed on Earth, which means those ships may have actually had access to hyperspace and therefore faster than light travel even this far back, meaning that they might have just been giant interstellar cruise ships and not generation ships or ones where people were in stasis because it wouldn't take an inordinate amount of time to reach the destination planet. I don't think the destination being that specific nebula really matters because while it does look cool, it doesn't have any known planet, so it's not something in real life where we could look at and say, I'd understand why they'd want to send colonists there. What is important though is the Carina Sagittarius arm of the Milky Way. That is because the Sagittarius constellation is where the home planet of humanity in Xenogears, Neo-Jerusalem, or that universe's equivalent to Second Jerusalem in Saga, is located. We don't actually know anything about Second Jerusalem in Saga itself other than it existed and stopped being the capital at one point, so it's very possible that the capital of the Galaxy Federation was this mysterious planet in Sagittarius before it was moved on to Third Jerusalem and on to the 5th that we see in-game. That being said, this was the 8th ship being launched out, and I would assume that the in-space capital of this new burgeoning civilization would be whatever planet the first ship made it to, so unless that ship went to the same place the Icarus did, it's probably just another Gears reference. As an aside, the ship's name being Icarus isn't a reference to anything from another Xeno game, but it is a very fitting ship name for the Xeno series, so it fits along well with the rest of the fleet. What is definitely a reference, though, is the name Earth-Life Colonization Project, as that's certainly a thing from X. The thing about this is, what was one term in Japan was actually localized into two different terms, Earth-Life Colonization Project and Project Exodus. And both of those names are mentioned in this radio broadcast, which is really cool because they are really hammering in the X references here. Doesn't make X canon, but I do love how they're going out of their way to make the references as blatant and noticeable to someone who played X in English as possible. Another reason X can't be canon to the trilogy is the nature of the two projects' exodus. The trilogy version appears to just be humanity settling space because they have the ability to now that they have the conduit, where in X, it was a project of desperation so that some humans could survive when the alien attack came. Without spoiling X, humanity definitely knew the alien armies were coming and set up the entire project so some people would be able to escape and the race could live on. With that being the case, there's no way the general public was made aware that an alien invasion was coming, probably right up until they could see the ships in the sky and hear some explosions. It was almost certainly pitched the exact same way this radio broadcast talks about the trilogy/saga version of Project Exodus, as the chosen few of humanity reaching for the stars and at last extending our reach to the great beyond now that we've evolved so as a species. Now, obviously, Wilhelm was almost certainly involved in the Saga Blade Trilogy version of Project Exodus, so it wasn't as benevolent as I'm making it sound, but I'm pretty sure the objective of that Project Exodus was actually to colonize other planets and not current objectives survive. Next sentence time? I think it's next sentence time. The Icarus is the 8th interstellar colony ship dispatched as part of Project Exodus, bringing the total number of colonists sent out to the stars to 3 million. This one doesn't bring anything new to the table, but as I said before, it does reference the second English name of what was known in Japanese as the Earth-Life Colonization Plan. And yeah, that means the term Exodus was actually a localization addition in X. This may very well be the only time the localizers added more religious content to a Xeno game instead of removing or obfuscating it. Next sentence. The coalition government plans to send out ships 9 to 13 in the course of the year. Again, coalition government, same name the government in X used. The scenarios might be completely different, but a lot of the same things did end up happening between the X and the Trilogy/Saga Earths. As we know from a lot of stuff from X, that generally wasn't a good thing for the vast majority of people, unfortunately. The coalition government plans to send out ships 9 to 13 in the course of this year. The 9th vessel, departing in July, heralds a new generation of ultra-long-range colony ships, known officially as the Philadelphia-class mothership. This is another very fun Xenogears reference, as the ship, the Eldridge, which is seen in the intro movie of that game, is a Philadelphia-class ship. Unfortunately, while the events of Gears or something similar to them could always take place long after the Saga games, the timeline doesn't match up, as the Eldridge scene from the beginning of Xenogears takes place the same year as Xenosaga Episodes 1 and 2, and that makes it impossible to combine characters who are equivalents to each other across the two games but would have to end up being the same person for the combined canon to work, while also causing us to run into an oops too many Zohars situation. Each vessel boasts a capacity of up to 1.5 million people, meaning that if all goes to plan, the project will send a total of 10 million people out into the great beyond. As I said before, this does directly contradict with what we know about the White Whale, but unfortunately this does also contradict with what we know about the Eldridge, as we're actually given specifications for that ship, and it's said to be 100 kilometers long. While Saga boasts a ship, admittedly constructed way later, that's 10 times that length, and I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility for Klaus's world to build a ship that size, I think the Eldridge was capable of storing more than 1.5 million people on it, so I'm thinking that this is just a nominal reference, and not an actual attempt to tie Gears, or an alternate version of Gears, directly into this canon. Next, we need to turn our eyes to a more earthly matter, and discuss the sentences that led up to the first instances in the history of the universe of people popping off for the name Dimitri Yuriev. Now for our next story. It concerns the Saviorite Human Rights Protection Bill, brought up in Congress last summer. This doesn't really shed any additional light on the nature of the government of this world. Like, the coalition government probably rose out of the United Nations, and obviously some sort of government overseeing the entirety of Earth would have a legislative body, and because of the way a lot of governments in the world are now, it probably would be something along the lines of a Congress or a Parliament, so that's not really a big deal. But what is Saviorite Human Rights Bill. While yes, this is clearly the origin of the Saviorite rebels we see in Xenoblade 2, the Japanese name of those rebels in this bill is actually the exact same as the Salvatore faction from Xenosaga, a faction headed by and originated by Dimitri Yuriev. This is actually where we run into our first potential timeline snarl, but I think I'm going to save that for the end. The rest of the broadcast reads, earlier today, we heard the 13 authorities have petitioned against the proposal, and as the Justice Ministry's 7th Special Commission on Human Rights debates once more on its validity, the possibility that the proposal may be scrapped seems to be more likely. The proposed measure has sparked a lot of public debate, so many will be watching the government and the Commission very closely. Then Barry says, there is much apprehension about the bill failing to make it all the way through the legislative process, and indeed, that seems to be exactly what's happening now. And Sienna ends with, indeed. And now Dimitri Yuriev, councilperson from the Minos Authority, has issued a statement concerning the matter at hand. Please stay with us. I'm going to very briefly talk about the non-Xenosaga stuff here first. First off, the fact that in the scene, believe it or not, Niall and Matthew are actually having a conversation. And Niall is mentioning how, oh, this world was perfect. This is exactly what Alpha wants to build. We can all live in harmony and everything will be perfect. While the radio is talking about a human rights protection bill being hotly contested and likely to be turned down, is bravo theming in social commentary. I love it when Xeno does stuff like that, because it's usually very good. And then I also want to talk about the 2 additional numbers we see here, the 13 authorities and 7th Special Commission. I'm pretty sure these numbers only exist for the purpose of adding flavor because we don't really know exactly what any of this means. My guess, and this is completely irrelevant to anything that's going to be important going forward in the future, so I don't really care if it's wrong, is that the 13 authorities are semi-autonomous regions that aren't directly under complete coalition government control, and as such would have better reason to contest stuff like laws that are controversial and being discussed by the coalition at large. We have the Rhadamanthus and Minos authorities directly name-dropped here, which suggests to me, of course, that Aeacus, the third tower, also has its own authority around its base, and I'm guessing the people in the first low-orbit station and living in Elysium are also considered part of the Rhadamanthus authority administratively, but again, this literally doesn't matter at all. I'm just like thinking about this kind of stuff. And there being 7 commissions on human rights in a justice ministry because it apparently takes that many different groups of people to realize that people should probably have human rights is a very government thing to do. But as for the numbers themselves, 13 is probably Jesus and the 12 Apostles. This is a Xeno game. This is now connected to Xenosaga. There's going to be Jesus stuff in here. And considering that in Xenosaga there are 12 Zohar emulators named after the Apostles, and then the main Zohar itself, which is also known as Marian Kind, or Child of Mary, or literally Jesus, that's probably what they're going there. As for the 7th Special Commission, I think this matters even less and has even less significance because this is Xenoblade 3. They like putting the number 7 in places in this game. I'm pretty sure that's all that is. Anyway, Dimitri Yuriev, I think, was given more quality content in this expansion than Zed, the main villain of Xenoblade 3 was, and that is just hilarious. I'm not one for reaction compilations, but I do really want to see a reaction compilation, not of this scene, but specifically of people who have played the entire Xeno series, specifically to seeing the name Dimitri Yuriev pop up. Because I've seen that out of like 3 or 4 people at this point, and it's been hilarious every single time. I never record my first playthroughs of anything, but I really wish I did in this case, specifically for that moment. But first though, I think we need to discuss the radio itself, because it has the Vector Industries logo on it. Now, we know Vector was around at this time in the Xenosaga universe, and we know Vector Industries making radios is a completely reasonable thing to do, because obviously they went on to make Cosmos. Them being a technology company 4,000 years earlier makes sense, and of course, because Wilhelm is the CEO, the company is capable of still existing and retaining some of the same purpose the entire time. Vector making a radio isn't what's important. It's the fact that they put the Vector logo on a radio in a Xenoblade game that's important. I just want to remind everyone that Bandai Namco is listed as special thanks in the credits of Future Redeemed. This means they went out of their way to check with Bandai Namco to make sure it was okay to include these Xenosaga elements in Future Redeemed. Even if they didn't need explicit permission, they at least did it as a nicety. Nintendo completely owns Xenoblade X and everything associated with it. If they wanted to have the logo on the radio be a reference to something, they could have very easily went with Sakuraba Industries. Sakuraba is an arms manufacturer from X that is also very, very clearly X's equivalent to Vector in a lot of different ways that I can't really talk about without spoiling X stuff, but suffice to say, it's basically the same thing. And yet, instead of just doing that, they went out of their way to make it a Xenosaga thing, even though that would have been infinitely more work. It's not the fact that X contradicts directly with the numbered games, or that Saga has the most references here, because trust me, it does if you take everything into account. It's the fact that, while the X references and Gears references didn't require any additional hoops and potential legal clearances to jump through in order to be included, the Saga ones did. If they wanted to include a legally distinct Saga reference, they could have just changed the name of the Icarus to the Damarung or the Durandal or something like that, and everything would have been completely okay. But they went out of their way to make sure Bandai Namco was okay with them including the Vector Industries logo and the name Dimitri Yuriev. This is a DLC campaign for a franchise that's probably in Nintendo's like 3rd tier of popularity, and while I'm sure Monolith has some degree of a blank check after the work they put in on Breath of the Wild to make that such a massive, high quality and successful game, there's no way they would have been allowed to do any of this explicit Saga referencing unless it was actually going to matter in the long run. While things fit remarkably well, all things considered, There are quite a few hiccups and things that will probably have to be retconned, most likely on the Saga side to more fit along with Blade, in order for things to be a perfectly cohesive unit going down in the future. Now, you think I'm going to start talking about Dimitri Yuriev now, but personally, I think it's very funny to keep pushing the discussion of him back as far as possible, because A, he deserves it, and 2, nobody cared about him until this past week. Especially looking in from the outside, this is a very hilarious situation, and I'm going to keep milking the funny as much as possible. Anyway, I think we need to talk about the post-credit scene first, because that allows me to discuss a few different things. After an establishing shot of Jupiter looking towards the sun, we see apparently what Ionios looks like from the outside, a weird spatial distortion looking thing in the shape of an infinity symbol, which is of course the symbol of Mobius. This then separates into the two separate planets we see Ionios separate back into when Origin is reactivated. As they drift apart, these planets glow. The one on the left glows an Agnian yellow, and the one on the right a Kavesi blue. And then, in a flash of light, only one planet remains. And while the others were translucent, and the representation of Ionios was completely transparent and just looked like some ripples in space, this one is completely solid. The implication is, of course, that the worlds of Xenoblade 1 and Xenoblade 2 were able to reunite properly somehow, be it just purely through the emotions of people like Noah and Mio who remember each other, or through a longer period of contact and technological development. Either way, it seems like these worlds have escaped from the pocket dimensions they were stuck in, and are now one planet. And then we see a blue light falling towards it from space. This planet is a true reformed Earth made from those two worlds, and that light falling is Cosmos, finally home and lining up with the events of the post-credit scene of Xenosaga 3. I'm just gonna point out the obvious here. People somehow think this was Mira. Like, Allrest and Bionis used to be Earth before they were split off. That was very directly established. And we know that Mira is an Earth, right? Oh. I forgot about this whole section of the video when I did the spoiler warning. There will be X spoilers until the timestamp you see on screen now. I should also leave a thing in the description so you can skip them. Like, the establishing shot is Jupiter. Do you really think the Samarians made an entire second solar system? One with a conduit and all the Klaus stuff happening? And then that Earth got split up and then reformed into Mira, which is not Earth? All the while, at the same time, another Earth that had the exact same history but without a conduit happened? And then also there are aliens? And both Earths were in the Milky Way because people there both recognized the Milky Way? And both had a United States and a coalition government? People also think that's Elma arriving on Earth, which, yeah, that does make more sense. At least you acknowledge that this planet is Earth, but that still doesn't make sense. Elma arrived in the 2020s AD. Earth was destroyed in X in 2054 AD. Klaus's experiment happened in 20XX AD. If you believe that the Ganglion and Ghost War destroyed Earth, the same time Klaus's experiment destroyed Earth, which is not the case, those are too contradictory to be reconcilable, Elma should have already made it there. And yet, you think the blue light falling to Earth, after both of those happen, all of the history of Xenoblade 1 and 2 happens, and then all of Xenoblade 3 happens, and then an indeterminate amount of time after that happens, is before Elma came there. I don't get it. Keep in mind, while that new planet being made there is Earth, and is in the same space Earth should be, that doesn't necessarily mean it's Earth being recreated at the beginning of life, or everyone from the other universes were destroyed. They use the interlink colors. Like, one of the planets is yellow, the other is blue, and then the flash of light is green, like people interlinking. It's them combining together. It's Noah and Mio being able to see each other again. They're not getting wiped out. It's not an annihilation event type thing. The two worlds have come together. Everyone is still on those worlds. This still can't be a prequel Earth to X, because in X, Earth's history is identical to that of the real world, barring the families of certain characters existing and a few characters having been born already, at least up to the point the game was written, if not still present day. That is completely incompatible with Earth being recreated and its history starting again, but also Catgirls are there. The only options that make a remote amount of sense for this are Cosmos, or something different that's a reference to both the White Whale and Cosmos. And given the nature of all the other Xenosaga stuff in here, it's gotta be Cosmos, because again, You just need to make a few tweaks and light retcons to make Saga fit perfectly. The biggest of those is of course to fix the timeline, as the Xenosaga trilogy takes place in the years Transcend Christ, or TC, 4767 and 4768. The Transcend Christ year numbering system was adopted in AD 2510, which means it's been about 5200 years since Earth was destroyed when the Saga series happens. This is obviously an issue when you take into account the fact that there are NPCs in Xenoblade 1 who have lived longer than that, and despite life evolving from scratch again on Allrest, their society has had a calendar that's been going for 4058 years. We can pretty reasonably assume, based on dialogue between Melia and Nia in Xenoblade 3, that Bionis and Allrest operate on the same time scale. But now that we know that they were the same world ripped up in two, occupying the same physical space where Earth used to be, but in two separate pocket dimensions, it's not unreasonable to say that there was some time dilation in play, and time flowed way faster in those two worlds relative to outside, which is how you can have Zanza resetting life on Bionis several times, with the current iteration that results in Xenoblade 1 having existed for at least 10,000 years, and the entirety of life re-evolving and gaining sentience on Allrest within the span of only a few thousand years for people on the outside. Then we have another too many Zohars issue. I think most people have basically just written off that the Conduit is a Zohar emulator and the real one was not in Radamanthus at all, but I think there's a bit of wiggle room around that. Obviously, there can only be one Zohar in the universe, but now we know Allrest isn't just the ruins of Klaus's Earth. It was in a different dimension, which means it's a different lower domain than the rest of the universe, so I'm pretty sure you could have a different connection to the upper domain in it. The only weirdness that raises is what happened to the actual Zohar in the rest of the universe, and how did it end up in the places it ended up in Saga, because after Earth was lost, all we really know is that it made it to planet Abraxas at some point. Obviously, we already know that there are ships leaving Earth at the time of the radio broadcast. They might be part of the immigrant fleet, or they might be the predecessors to that. And Dimitri Yuriev has to make it off-planet at some point, obviously, as well, so there being survivors isn't the big deal. It's the whole gathering the Zohar thing. We're told that the incident that destroyed Earth had the potential to spread across the entire universe, but Wilhelm contained the anomaly, which is why we have a lost Jerusalem and not a complete apocalypse. Obviously, we now know his method of doing that was to split the world in two and contain them in separate pocket dimensions, with one containing the actual ruins of the old world, two of the Trinity processor cores in the Conduit, and the other containing the third core, half of Klaus and Galea. And obviously that means Wilhelm escaped the destruction of Earth as well. We also know that Ormus existed at the time, and since they were the ones to bring the Zohar to Abraxas in the first place, they were probably the ones to take it away from Earth. And Wilhelm just so happens to be the founder and leader of Ormus. So my guess would be, when the Klaus experiment happens, Wilhelm is already off-planet because he could probably tell it was coming from the Compass of Order and Chaos or whatever, contains the anomaly to the region around Earth. I'm honestly guessing that the two things stuck in the pocket dimension were just the planet Earth, and not even anything around it. Like, you could argue the moon was there because Allrest has the moon, but honestly, I personally believe that it's just seeing the sky that Earth would see from that same space, because Allrest is in the same physical space as Earth, just not in the same dimensional space, so maybe they could see out of the dimensional barrier and like what the night sky was supposed to look like. Completely different in the Xenoblade 1 world, those stars are just balls of ether. Anyway, I'm guessing that after that happens, the Conduit is still there on Allrest, but the Zohar is just present floating in space where Earth used to be, so Wilhelm could just take the Ormus ship he was on, which he was probably the captain of too, because it's Wilhelm, that just makes sense at this point, turned it around, picked the Zohar back up, went away, and then pulled more strings so that Earth would be known as Lost Jerusalem and no one would try to find it. Also again, something the UMN existed to some degree at the time. I'm pretty sure Wilhelm could have transported as many people as he wanted away from Earth, even if all the formal ships hadn't been launched at the time, so, like, anything's really possible when that guy's around. As for the timeline in this era of events, that doesn't contradict with anything. we're actually given a more ambiguous time frame in Saga compared to Blade for Earth to be destroyed, as the Transcend Christ calendar was not adopted until AD 2510, and the only event set in stone beforehand is the Zohar being discovered and then brought to Canada, yes that's real, in the 21st century. Obviously the Blade stuff then restricts that, so Klaus's experiment, being the thing to destroy Earth in the end, happened in the 21st century as well, unless they're going to retcon Xenoblade 2, which I don't see the point. And that doesn't actually contradict with anything, it just provides a bigger restriction to the ambiguous timeline we already knew about. What does potentially contradict, though, is the fact that there were multiple mad scientists playing around with the Zohar at that time, apparently, because we can't forget the reason Canada is canon to Xenosaga, and one of the biggest hitches in this potential timeline, literally Keanu. You won't know anything about this unless you know about the story of Xenosaga A Missing Year, which is fairly vital to completely understand the trilogy, by the way, so they really better translate that to some degree if they ever port Saga. But regardless, the guy in charge of Zohar experimentation in Canada was a vector industry scientist named Grimoire Verum. He did a lot of early experimentation and UMN-related stuff on the Zohar, and accidentally disappeared his daughter Nephilim, the girl who looks like a young Ellie from Xenogears, in the process. All that's really said after that, though, is that experimentation continued until the Zohar activated again, leading to a much bigger matter shift that was going to cover all of Lost Jerusalem, which obviously led to Wilhelm sealing it away and all of that stuff happening. So, you're gonna have to do a little bit of tweaking of things, but this is all fairly reconcilable. Grimoire Verum did the first experiment on the behalf of Vector early on, and after his daughter was disappeared by it, he was taken off of the Zohar project, and it was instead brought up to the Radamanthus space station. We don't really know anything about the authority overseeing that stuff, but given how Dimitri Yuriev wasn't exactly on the same page as Wilhelm thousands of years later in Xenosaga, it's possible that Vector was the one bankrolling or doing the grunt work on all of the Beanstalk projects and all of that stuff, or that it was just a coalition government thing, but because Wilhelm is Wilhelm, he also had a finger in that pie and was pulling those strings, so yeah, clearly Vector, the private company, can't be trusted with the Zohar experimentation. One of the lead scientists killed his own daughter with it. Okay, let's move it to a government research team. Still Wilhelm behind the strings, cause it's always Wilhelm, that's the moral of Xenosaga. And adding on to that, we don't even know if Klaus was the head of the Conduit project on Radamanthus to begin with. We don't even know if Galea was his subordinate. She could have been his peer, and that scene doesn't change at all, so it's not like there wasn't room for there to be someone he was working under, too. Given that Grimoire somehow became a UMN existence sometime in between Nephilim getting disappeared and A Missing Year, I'm still inclined to believe that he was taken off the project, if not screwed up by it himself as well, and then it was given over to the Radamanthus people, and whether or not Klaus was in charge of them doesn't matter, but he could have been off-screen on that space station. Everyone except Klaus and Galea was locked out of that room, and we didn't see everyone trying to get in there. He could have also just been asleep or on his lunch break. We don't know. There's enough empty space where we can easily fit some slightly contradictory Saga stuff in without too much issue or hassle. The one really big problem here, though, yeah, we're finally talking about him, is Dimitri Yuriev. His backstory actually does contradict some of the Blade stuff on a fundamental level. Klaus always was the Xenoblade version of Yuriev, as the guy in Xenosaga is a power-hungry politician trying to become a god. However, the slight bit of portrayal of him we've seen in the radio scene depicts him in a much more benevolent light. Like, he is a politician still, but it seems like he's actively fighting for human rights and leading a faction that's going to try and support that stuff, as opposed to trying to gain power for himself. Him being alive for this long isn't a contradiction with anything, as he does possess the power to transfer his consciousness to other bodies, and it's already canon to the Saga series that he has done that to live for at least a few hundred years. Extending that to several thousand isn't completely out of the realm of possibility, but that's not the only part of his backstory that doesn't make sense. Yuriev is one of the Designer Children, a group of people genetically modified by the Galaxy Federation to combat Ormus, that are later also referred to as Salvators because of Yuriev's influence. He also only gained his ability to body hop after making contact with Udu in a UMN experiment. The label Designer Child does of course still apply after the person has grown up to be an adult. That's not the problem. What is a problem is, we have a Yuriev already existing before there's a Galaxy Federation. I do think it's fairly safe to assume that the Earth Coalition government becomes the Galaxy Federation at some point after Earth is lost, but the whole Ormus-controlled immigrant fleet that the Federation is trying to fight against thing that was the impetus for the Designer Children project definitely hadn't happened at that point, so it does seem like Yuriev is just some guy here. It is already implied that he was driven somewhat insane by his contact with Udu, so him being a normal politician here isn't unusual. It's just the fact that he can't have been a designer child unless he was manipulated later on. On the other hand, though, we have the Saviorite Human Rights Protection Bill, which again carries the same name as Yuriev's Salvatore faction in Japanese. This suggests to me that it's defending the human rights of genetically modified individuals, which means that Yuriev probably is one in that case. In that case, they're probably just going to retcon the original purpose of the Designer Children. The ones made after the fall of Lost Jerusalem were for the purpose of counteracting Ormus, while the initial ones were just to see if it could be done, or for the purposes of some sort of weird eugenics, which Yuriev definitely won't have taken to heart based on his own children, but we're not talking about that here. And as for the UMN thing, I'm not really sure about that. They might change it so that he was on the Minos Tower or something when Klaus did his experiment, and that made him contact with Udu and all that weird stuff happened there, or the Udu experiment just happened and he was slightly better at hiding the fact that he's a bastard at that time period, and maybe he was in his original body and he got worse after body hopping for the first time or something like that. Basically, Yuriev's backstory is the one thing I was able to find so far that definitely needs some substantial retcons in order to fit perfectly, but him being around on Earth and being an adult vaguely around the time of Klaus's experiment also means that he could have participated in Grimoire's Zohar experiments, and that's where he got his UMN contact. Like, maybe at the same time Nephilim was put into it, he was there too. He made contact with Udu, got his ridiculous powers, and went a little mad, and then Nephilim got disappeared, and all that stuff happened. I honestly think that might be where they go when they choose to retcon this, because they're obviously cooking up something Saga-y, and if this is the biggest hang-up I have with making things fit properly, and even then have a few ways they could make it work out without a lot of issues, I'm pretty sure the people who actually write this series are gonna be able to make it even better. Now, I'm sure I'm missing some Saga things that also contradict. I'm also sure I'll be able to come up with ways that you could at least retcon the stuff smoothly to work properly, but that's all I was able to figure out just from having seen the scene for the first time less than a week ago, and discussing a little bit with a few other people who have also played Saga. I'm obviously also going to make more coherent and narrower scope videos explaining some of this stuff more in detail, and probably going into other ways I think they could make things fit properly, but this has really just been my stream of consciousness, because I needed to get a lot of the stuff off my chest before I started mixing things up in my own head, or forgetting things, or going too deep down the theory rabbit hole for anyone other than me to understand what I'm thinking about. And I also wanted to at least attempt to shut down some of the excopium. It does seem like the majority of people buying into this are people who haven't played Saga and as such did not get the opportunity to know better about this. So hopefully my position is enough to get people to sort of reconsider that kind of thing, because I don't want X fans to get their hopes up massively about something again, because unlike the last few times there was X-related discussion where I was all on board with it, I am very confident it's going to be nothing this time, and don't want people to get their hopes up. I know exactly what's going to happen if too many people buy into this. The entire community is going to start expecting something from X, then when the Xenosaga Remasters reports are announced, everyone's going to get mad. People are going to play them and enjoy them, but because they had the X stuff drilled into their head for so long, seeing the other side of the connections Future Redeemed was trying to make between Blade and Saga isn't going to register, because they weren't expecting to see that, because they don't think Xenosaga is connected. And then, while yeah, there might be an Exporter Definitive Edition in there, they're still going to go ballistic when they see the combination Xenoblade Xenosaga thing in the future, because they've been expecting something that they were never promised. Now, I am very confident about the Saga connections. But those being there does not ensure by any means that we're actually going to get new games building on that. The entire point of tying Blade to Saga might have been a neat Easter egg to make fans smile, and just to show longtime Xeno fans that they haven't forgotten about the old series, and of course to get people more interested in the Xenosaga ports or remasters when those happen, but it might have never been intended to be the basis for a future game. Except for the part where the executive director of the Xenoblade series said that playing 3 in Future Redeemed would tell us exactly what the future of the series would be. And basically the only content that we were given that wasn't Future Redeemed content was tying things into Xenosaga. And we cannot forget, while X ended on an explicit cliffhanger and left a lot of things open-ended, Saga did not completely end conclusively. It was originally intended as an anthology series with only the character of Cosmos carrying on throughout the entire thing, after all, and Episode 3, while it did include elements from later entries that were planned, was still ultimately not the entire planned story. And in fact, it did end on an open note. While Wilhelm and the Eternal Recurrence plan had been stopped, that meant that the universe was still destined to collapse, and it was said that the secret to halting that lies on Lost Jerusalem. Shion and co. head out for it, and Cosmos and Chaos go dormant, yet it's been said that as long as the universe, as people who love the Xeno series will it, they will return. And hey, we now know that Cosmos is home. She's landing on a place with people who have also been through hardships, who have stopped a ton of different threats, and she's going to be found by a lot of people who are absolutely going to be willing to help in another situation like this. We of course don't know how long the worlds have been merged when Cosmos arrives, or even how long they were separate again before they merged, but we do know that the descendants of the heroes of 1, 2, and 3 are also capable of incredible things based on all we've seen from the city people, and hey, what was Future Redeemed about if not that as well? So I'm pretty sure our favorite android is going to be in good hands. We also don't know if the crew of the Elsa is going to still be around at that time too, and if they're ever going to make it to Earth as well, but regardless, Cosmos still remembers them. She'd carry on their will if they're gone, and that's also a pretty important thing about Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed, I'd say. They're going to figure this stuff out, and I can only hope Monolith chooses to make a game that lets me see it directly. Also, I'd like to point out one cool thing before I go. Ionios is frozen in one moment in time, so despite all the time dilation stuff I talked about before, whatever time Ionios exists in is going to be the same moment both inside and outside the pocket dimension. In Future Redeemed, we fight Alpha, who takes a very Xenogears reminiscent mech form in the final boss fight. In Xenosaga 3, the party fights against Omega, a giant mech using the power of the Zohar that has little bits flying around reminiscent of mechs from Xenogears. I'm pretty sure that if they ever follow up on this whole connection thing they've made, they're gonna say that the Liberators were fighting Alpha in Ionios, and Ionios happened to take place at the same time the Xenosaga party was fighting Omega. The beginning and the end, the first and the last. The Ouroboros circles around, things become connected, and this Xeno story never truly ends. But would we really have it any other way? Until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.